Yeah, I joined Microsoft in 1991. I was 2 years out of grad school, did my MBA, really had no business being there. I don't know if any of you ever wake up in the morning and you kind of feel like, oh my gosh, like I really don't know that I really belong in this hyper smart environment. I definitely felt that way when I joined Microsoft in 91. And by 98, I was a little bit burned out, the whole 7-year itch thing after 7 years of, way too many meetings and way too many, flights and stuff like that. I decided to go off to Nepal and do an 18-day trek just to kind of clear my head and get away from all the Annapurna circuit. There's actually a rumor that if you went high enough in the Himalayas, you could escape the sound of Steve Ballmer's voice. And I decided to, give that a shot. No, I loved working for Steve. I learned a lot under him. But when I was on day 2 of my trek, I met a headmaster who wanted to show me his school. It was a really ramshackle, dilapidated school, dirt floors, no desks, 80 children crammed into a room that probably should not have held more than 20. And then he said, well, come see the school's library. And I thought, oh, this will be the exciting, optimistic part of the story. How many of you were library nerds as kids? You work at Google, so that's probably a fairly safe question. So I was like a total library nerd as a kid. So I thought this would be the exciting part of the tour. Kids with smiles on their faces reading books. Totally wrong. Empty room. Completely devoid of children's books. And I asked the headmaster, how can this be? You have 450 kids showing up. They want to learn. And their parents want them to learn. And the headmaster said, well, in Nepal, we're too poor to afford education. But until we have education, we will always remain poor. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks as being the cruelest possible catch-22, that you have these kids who are 5 years old or 6 years old or 7 years old, and they're being told you've lost the lottery of life. And thankfully, the headmaster, like me, was an action-oriented optimist. He said, perhaps, sir, you will someday come back with books. And I thought this would be a great reason to make an annual leave from Microsoft and come back to Nepal and trek. So I was like, yep. Kind of selfish motivation to sign up, but I'm kind of joking a little bit with the selfish motivation. I grew up in a small town that was very middle class. We had a great school library, and we had a great community library that had been built in 1896. So I thought, well, here's my pay it forward. I'll thank the world for my libraries with one library, and didn't realize we wouldn't really stop there. But I went back a year later with 3,000 donated books on the back of 6 rented donkeys, and my 73-year-old father in tow as my unpaid right-hand man, and it just felt really good. And I said, well, that was fun. Like, maybe we'll keep doing it. And that's really that was the point of departure. It was that trip in '99, returning and seeing the smiles on the faces of the kids who had never seen brightly colored children's books before. The library shelves were suddenly full. And that's the moment I started to kind of edge my way to the door of Microsoft to think maybe my next act will not be in tech. Maybe it will be in something a bit more basic.
It's like you read the numbers here and you think like 7.8 million children whose lives you've touched. Like, do you have any stories or like kids that really touched you in particular? Like you saw them, you saw they learned something, you saw that they got access to this book. Like, yeah. I mean, how like what is that experience for like one of those 7.8 million kids, and how does it really change their life? To be able to have the books and the libraries. And
yeah. It's pretty amazing to meet these kids. I hope one day all of you get a chance, including you. You're always welcome to come visit our projects. With 1,600 schools and 15,000 libraries, there's lots of places to go visit and meet the kids and meet not just kids, but the parents and the grandparents whose lives are being changed. And I'll tell you a story about a student, but first I'll tell you a story about being in Nepal with a number of our chapter leaders who are running fundraising chapters all over the world. We're very entrepreneurial, so we've actually given birth to 57 fundraising chapters around the world, 12,000 people involved. They have not quit their day job to go change the world. They've kept their day job, but they're changing the world through raising funds for Room to Read, including our San Francisco chapter. But the Tokyo chapter co-founder, Susan Lodge, was with me on this trip. And Susan told a story about being in a village where we had a lot of girls in our long-term girls education program. And it's, as you and I both know from our discussions, it's depressingly inexpensive to change a girl's life through education. It's $250 per girl per year. And so the fact that over 100 million girls in the developing world woke up this morning and did not go to school is, to me, just an absolutely avoidable tragedy because it's not an expensive problem to fix. But Susan said to me, John, you've got me, Room to Read's got me forever, because I just was talking to a grandmother, and she was holding my hand, and with tears in her eyes, she said, I can die now that I know that my granddaughter is going to get educated. And Susan, you got a fan for life. So there's the grandmother. We watch parents. And everything we do at Room to Read is under a challenge grant model. The idea is you can't help people if they don't want to help themselves. So we don't go into a village and build them a library or build them a school. Hey, step aside, local people. We're here to help you. We say we're going to help you, but only if you want to help yourself. So the parents will put in sweat equity to each project. So I've watched these parents at school openings, at library openings, where the mothers will come up and say, they'll point down to the river. That's a pretty steep decline, and they'll say, I carried the sandbags from the river up. And then other parents, the fathers, will say, well, I helped to dig the foundation. So it's very much of a self-help model. And those parents motivate me, right? Because parents everywhere are the same. They want their kids to have a better life than they've had. And it almost always comes down to education. If you can only bequeath one thing to your child, you probably would want to bequeath education. But to land the plane to your question with the students, one of my favorite stories of a student I met with last summer, my father decided for his 86th birthday he wanted to go to Zambia with me on a trip that I was doing. And I love my parents. They're such adventurous people. And we were in this little village in rural Zambia, and I met a kid named Jairus. He's a 13-year-old student and really well-read. He has a room to read library in his school, and he was very articulate in welcoming me to the library. And officially, he was like the head of the welcoming committee that was welcoming our delegation. And I talked to him afterwards. I said, Jairus, you seem like a very smart young man. And he said, yes. And I said, well, what would you like to be when you grow up? And Jairus said, oh, I will be the first Zambian to be Secretary General of the United Nations. I said, okay, that's great. So you're learning a lot in your library about leadership. And he said, yes, but I've also learned that I will have to do other things along the way. That will not be my first job. I said, okay, what would be like an interim kind of lily pad you would jump to on the way to that side of the pond? And he said, well, I will first be president of Zambia. And it's kind of a funny story, right? So this was in July last summer. Well, in October, a couple of months later, at the United Nations, I was a guest of Gordon Brown, who's running this amazing Education First initiative for Ban Ki-moon. And Ban Ki-moon was telling a story about growing up in post-war South Korea in a village that had been decimated by the war. They were learning outside. The teacher had a stick, was drawing in the dirt. That was their chalkboard. They had no books. And Ban Ki-moon said, then one day, these books showed up. And we were really excited. My parents said to me, you must read every one of those books. And he said, if we open them up on the inside front cover, it says, a gift from the United Nations. Anybody getting chills now just thinking about that fact that the kid in the village with the stick and the dirt and the donated books is now Secretary General of the United Nations? So I don't think Jairus' story is really that far-fetched. And when I think of it, I think about one of my heroes, Nelson Mandela. What would South Africa look like today had Nelson Mandela not been one of the lucky few black South African kids to get educated in that era? What if Wangari Maathai had not had education? The Greenbelt movement in East Africa would not have happened. All these kids are out there, right? We're all born with the same gray matter. So if we can just reach them at a young age, I think those Jairus stories, Jairus could be the next Ban Ki-moon. We'll never know. We'll never know unless we try to reach every one of them. If we don't reach them, we know it won't happen. But if we don't try, we'll never know.
So is that a goal of yours, to reach every one of them?
Ultimately, yes. Yeah. Not just room to read, right? The greatest things that happen in human history happen when there's a movement. But movements have to have, you got to have the lead sled dogs. And you got to have a lot of sled dogs to pull the sled. But we hope to be one of the lead sled dogs. Yeah. And our interim goal was originally to reach 10 million children across the poorest parts of the world by 2020. As you know, because I know that you read all the investor reports we send you diligently, we're actually on track to reach 10 million children 5 years early by 2015. And to be clear, we don't have, we're not a movement of billionaires. So they're welcome, but it's not like we're not a top-down model. We don't have celebrities involved, but it's just ordinary average people who are coming together. We've reached 7.5 million kids already. We'll reach 10 million kids by 2015. And then from there, I want to start sentences with the words every child. Right? Every child gets a chance to read. Every child gets a habit of reading. Every girl child gets to go to school alongside the boys. Because in the developing world today, about 40% of girls don't go to school. Right? And that's just a shame. So ultimately, we want to reverse the notion that any child can never be told again you were born in the wrong place, at the wrong time, to the wrong parents, and you therefore did not get educated. We think that notion belongs in the scrap heap of history. It might take 30 or 40 years to get it there, but boy, if we could do that, that's like the whole Archimedes, give me a lever long enough and I can move the earth. That would be, I think, earth moving. Will be
definitely. No, it will. It definitely will. So maybe you can tell us a little bit, so I understand you started one school, by accident. You went there. You thought, I'll just go there on my annual trek. But then you actually wound up creating 1,600 schools and 15,000 libraries. So like, how did that happen? How did it happen that you went from one to a lot? And what was like, maybe tell us a little about scaling. Like at Google, we're really good about scale. And I think one of the things that's been really impressive about you is you've been able to take something that you did once and actually scale it many, many times. So how did that happen?
I think that to really explain it, I have to make sure I just use the word we as often as I can, because I've always said I don't want to be the leader of an organization. I want to be one of many, many, many leaders of a global movement. So that requires you to, A, hire smart, B, recruit volunteers in a really, really smart manner, delegate, 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 right? Founders have a duty to get out of the way with certain things that they do well and don't do well. And if you ask them to my team, they can probably give you a really long list of the stuff that I don't do very well. One of the things that I happen to do well, according to my board, is I'm a good rainmaker, and they think I'm a decent public speaker, and they think I'm pretty good with the media. So about 5 years ago, I faced the choice of, do you want to be CEO, or do you want to backfill that position and go be a full-time ambassador? And I write in a book about that, right? Because I mean, no founder's journey is done until they actually kind of extract themselves, from that position. And so that was for me a tough thing. But one of my mentors, a banker at Goldman Sachs, he said, "Look, the minute you're not CEO, what are you going to do?" He's like, "You're going to get your butt on a plane. You're going to fly around the world. You're going to raise money. You're going to speak. You're going to raise money. You're going to speak. And the Earth's going to spin faster the more times you can circle it, telling the room to read story and encouraging people to get along, to get involved." So I think for me, we have a great CEO, Erin Ganju, like me, a business person, ex-Goldman, ex-Unilever, brilliant woman. She's hired out a management team, so we can get a lot more done because of that. But I think for us, a lot of it was just kind of, it's like the law of, just compounding. We said, let's do 10 libraries our second year, then let's try to do 40, and let's try to do 100, and let's try to do 1,000. And it just, I don't know that there's any secret sauce to it. A lot of it for us is just the execution. A lot of it is not being shy about asking for funding, right? Because, I mean, how many of you know an NGO that you love that's perpetually cash strapped?